Good morning again to everybody. I kind of went from that side to that side. I don't know if that was coordinated or not. If it was, good job on your unity this morning. We are looking at our second week of our sermon series on church clothes. I was complimented on the fact that I was wearing a suit for the wedding yesterday and asked today, "Where are your church clothes?" And I said, "It's in the closet." I think I'm all right. What we're looking at in this series, two things: holy manners, right? How do we treat one another? And a lot of that has to do with what's coming from the inside out, and then how that is presented in our actions to others. Holy manners. That's why we're looking at this based on Colossians 3, and we're picking out things from Colossians 3 and looking at them, as you see on the next page, you'll see it, with other scriptures to illuminate. We're also looking at growth together through this. And growth then, obviously, if we're going to treat each other in a certain manner, you expect that there's going to be growth and maturity that comes from the inside out, right? So there's a personal sense of growth. Paul in Colossians 3 also gets at corporate unity, that the church needs to have some sense of unity. That's one of the main points, and that's where we end the whole series. But I don't think the unity just ends there. It's not just us growing together and we're happy together forever and ever and we never add anybody else to the unified people we have, right? That's not the call. The call is to add other people to this. So I think that growth, it's not a byproduct, it's a product, that we would bring other people and want them to be a part of this thing we have too, that we found in Jesus Christ. So that's kind of the scope of the series and where it's going. This week we're talking about compassion. And as I was thinking through the whole concept of compassion, I'm not going to cover the whole thing. I thought about questions that I could ask about compassion. And something about compassion, I think, a broad question to ask is, to what depth am I compassionate? But that's a big question to get around, right? How compassionate am I to other people? But I don't think that we're talking this morning, probably for most of us, about a total blackness of the heart, right? Or a total hardness of the heart. That I'm just completely and totally uncompassionate to other people. I've met people who you can tell they have virtually no care for others in the world. It takes a lot of work. But what I suspect is that for most of us, we could look into our heart and find an area that's more callous than others. An area where we lack some compassion, or there's a darkness to it, or whatever you want to say, whatever image you want to use. And so that's much more of what we're looking at this morning. And I'll give you two stories as we start. One is a not real nice story about myself and lacking compassion. I'll start there because it hits us all, right? And I've told you before, I worked in downtown Chicago. This was, I guess, 6 years ago. I was working in downtown Chicago. I'd take the train in for an hour. And I was just about to take my call at the first church I went to serve in Indianapolis. And I was training my replacement. I was doing IT work at the building just south of the Sears Tower, and I'm not qualified for IT work. And neither was my replacement. I found an equally unqualified person who was also a covenant pastor who needed some part-time work. And so we were riding the train in together. And, you know, when you get off at Union Station after this hour-long ride, everybody from all the suburbs are coming together, and it's these narrow corridors with lots of people, and you all put your game face on and go through the crowd and get to where you're going just to get out of the 3 levels, or 4 levels you are underground to finally see daylight. It takes a lot of work, and it takes some sort of mental acumen just to get out of there. Well, I was pretty used to the scenario. I'd been doing it for a year and a half. 1 to 5 days a week, depending on the week. And my friend is there, and we get off the train. I'm ready to go, and he hasn't been doing this for all this time. And there's a woman that clearly on another train is having trouble getting off the train. Physically, she's just having trouble making that last step. And she's creating a clog behind her, and nobody's stopping to help her. And my friend just goes over there, cuts through the crowd, gently takes time to help her down. And she thanks him, and we walk off together. And I thought, how desensitized am I to my own environment that I didn't see? I saw her. I didn't stop. I didn't stop to help her. My friend did. He wasn't used to that environment. He said, well, there's somebody that needs help. I need to go help her. And I was focused on getting to work. That's one example. I was really sad about my own actions. I was really proud of my friend in that case. I thought this was a wonderful thing that he did, very simple. Here's a more recent example. And, as I've stated, our middle child was in the hospital this week again. And I really highly regard the hospital she was at, so this was an anomaly, I think. But as we were getting close to being discharged, I had a stroller full of stuff. I was going to take, you accumulate a lot of stuff even just in a couple days at the hospital. So you got bags and bags and bags. Put them all in the stroller, and I'm riding, pushing that along to go take the first load of things to the van before we get the kid. And I've got the two employees walking behind me who are both in their early 20s. One's talking on the phone, a very extended conversation about what do you want to do tonight that really wasn't going anywhere. They couldn't decide. And so I'm hearing this whole thing, and we finally all get on the elevator together and into the parking garage, go out the elevator, and there's still a door to go out. And so they dart off the elevator in front of me, and that's fine. I didn't have a kid, so I can work with that. But there's a woman on the other side of the door, car seat, baby. They bolt through the door and just let it close. And so I was in a position where I was able to help her through. And I walk out in the garage, and they're still standing there. So remember, this is an anomaly. I think highly of the hospital. And so I look at the two guys who are still standing there, and I said, guys, you're hospital employees, right? Yeah. Maybe in the future, you should hold the door in a situation like that. That's a good idea. Like they had never thought of it. It was really a fun moment. But if you look at either of those cases, right, there's a lack of compassion being exercised, but it's not being exercised. I don't think in my case, I don't think in these two guys' cases, it was out of malice in our heart, right? I definitely don't want to help that person. There was none of that went into it. It was simply that we'd lost some sort of sensitivity. We're so in our worlds that we don't notice some of these things sometimes for whatever reason. And I think that's one of the areas where perhaps compassion needs to be looked at in our own lives. Are there areas like that where I just miss it? And so let's look at Ephesians 4. Turn to it if you would. I'll also have this on the screen. We're just going to look at two parts of it. We read the whole passage, so you have the context. But let's focus on verse 17 through 19, verses 17 through 19, and then we'll skip down to 31. Verse 17 of chapter 4 begins, "So I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. They have lost all sensitivity. They have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed." Skip down to 31, where it says, "Get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as in Christ God forgave you." Incidentally, verse 32 there, worth your time to memorize. I find this one popping back into my head regularly. When I was doing children's ministry years ago, I wrote a song that was this verse, and we sometimes sing it at our house. It's very helpful to remember. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other as in Christ God forgave you. It's amazing how often that's a useful passage. If we were to look at what I'm going to do in outline today, here you go. Hard-hearted, tender-hearted. Tender-hearted, we'll talk about these terms in just a moment. I'm pulling that from the RSV or the King James. Either one has that. And the question we could ask is, do I have a hard heart or a hardening in my heart anywhere towards any specific whatever, people group, people, person, situation? If I have that, where is it? Then I want to look at what does it look like to live without a tender heart? And I really, instead of answering the question, how do you get a hard heart, I'd rather look at the opposite and say, how do I develop or maintain a tender heart? And you'll see from that, if you do the opposite, you might, in fact, develop a hard heart. So that's where we're going. And I want to give you a note just on the words that Paul uses that we're focusing on. He talks about a hardening of the heart. I think I had this up here. Well, that doesn't tell you a lot, does it? A hardening of the heart. It's a medical term in Greek, And it really refers to something like when a bone breaks or something like that, you get more of a hardening there, and it's less sensitive, honestly, because of the hardening is my understanding, and it's more dense often. It can also refer to sort of a stone that would be more dense than marble. In either case, what we're talking about is something that's insensitive and dense, which, let's be honest, if I'm playing guitar, which I like to do, I want to develop calluses that are insensitive and dense. If I am being talked to by somebody, I don't want them to call me insensitive and dense, do I? No. So there's a good and a bad. And he's using this term, and it's kind of a rough term to use for a hard heart. I mean, he's really indicating something that really just has no feeling at all. Then he also talks about being compassionate. I'm using the term tender-hearted today. I think compassion is a word. It's a wonderful word. It gets thrown around a lot. Tender-hearted maybe can help us grasp onto something a little better this morning. That's going to be our definition of compassion, if you're tender-hearted about things. And to be tender-hearted then is to have an affection that comes out of you because you truly care about somebody else. So it's not just pity for pity's sake. I don't just pity you, and I think I should take care of you because that's what people tell me I should do. No, it's that I actually care. I actually have sympathy because there's something inside of me that cares. So Paul talks, I think this will give us the words again, 17 through 19. You just get part of it here. Paul talks, don't live like the Gentiles. Now, this is an interesting way of saying it, right? Because who are the Gentiles? Wasn't he writing to the Gentiles? Isn't that part of who's involved in this? Not just the Gentiles, but they're part of the people. So he says, don't live like yourselves? Not really. In real simple terms, he's saying, look, you join this thing, following Jesus, this church, as a part of following Jesus. Don't live like those who are not the church, like the world around you, the secular world, in essence, is what he's saying. It's kind of a weird way of saying it, but that's what he's getting at. And so he says, don't live like that because there's a hard-heartedness that's out there. They're not tender hearts. That's not who you want to be. So he says, if we're to look at what Paul is saying about what it's like to have a hard heart in that situation, to not have this tender heart, he says a couple things. First, he says these people are living with futile thinking. The commentator William Barclay says a way to think about this is minds filled with empty things. That's what they have. They're futile thinking. It's empty minds. Or really, if you want to translate it, it's that there's a focus on everything but God, right? So it's idolatry in the end. They can idolize or worship anything else. If you want to see something, a passage that'll add to this, look at Romans 1, starting at verse 21 later. It's a complementary passage to this. But people are trying to find happiness, contentment, he says, in things other than God. That's what they're doing. And in the world Paul is writing to, that's clearly an option. There are clearly a lot of options in that world where people could find what they thought was happiness or contentment or something away from God. So it would either prevent them from coming to God in the first place, or if they were part of the church, they could easily drift away if they're not careful. He's saying, be careful of these things. Don't dwell on the empty things. That's not what you're called to do. Our time, I think it's no different. We can find all manner of empty things to dwell on, can't we? I mean, turn on the TV this afternoon, you will find all manner of empty things to dwell on. It's easy to find a distraction, and unfortunately, sometimes we're the kind of people, not just the church, but people in general, we can make an idol out of anything if left to our own devices, can't we? Paul says, don't do that. There's futile thinking out there. You're not a part of that. He also says, ignorance. Don't be a part of ignorance. And I would suggest this is a pathway rather than a location as we look at this. He says, there's people outside that are so lost, they've alienated themselves from God. They're separated from God. And they're not just distanced from God. They don't even have a clue in some cases that they're lost. They're just ignorant. They think they're on the right track. It's sort of like when you watch the old cartoons, right? And there's the sign pointing to Albuquerque and the other one pointing to Alaska, right? And they flip the signs. They think they're on the right path going to Alaska, but they're not. And eventually they'll figure it out, but it takes a long time. And so in that path, in that ignorance, sin is present, and it's called good. The right becomes wrong, the wrong becomes right, the right might not even be present in those cases. There's no compass. There's ignorance. And like I said, I think that's more of a pathway that takes us down to loss of sensitivity, where you just don't feel it anymore. And this can result in different ways, right? It can be with or without malice. The examples I used before, I don't think there was malicious intent on my part of ignoring someone. I don't think there was malicious intent on the part of these two young guys. Again, I think highly of the hospital. This was an anomaly, right? I don't think they were trying to be rude or mean or anything like that. We just get desensitized. And so the way we think is just the way the world works, and we haven't looked outside of that. Now, it can be malicious, right? It can move that way. And you could see this perhaps in mean-spirited jokes at work or at school, right? Where somebody starts to pick on one person, where those kind of places can become toxic because of that. You can see it in callous business practices, for instance. I mean, you can find places easily where there's an insensitivity, and it's done, and people know they're that insensitive. I remember, I grew up here in town. I went to high school here in town. I was in drumline at one of the high schools. We had a professional consultant come in, and he pointed out to us at one point, he said, well, in the professional music world where I work, if somebody's really not good, you can tell them that. And he said it in very mean ways. And he said, that's just okay in our world. And I thought, that doesn't seem okay to me. That's where this can go. We have such a loss of sensitivity that we're so concerned about the product or the end result that we're not really concerned anymore about the person. That's the difference. And so if we look at these things, Paul outlines these, among other things. He says there's some results, he says, that come along with this, the fighting and the brawling and all that wonderful stuff. But if we want to avoid this, if we want to turn the other way, I didn't want to talk about how do you not walk down the path of a hard heart. I'd rather talk about how do you develop or maintain a tender heart this morning. And so I'm going to look at some contrasts to these as our sort of points of application as we look at what Paul's outlined. Maybe I've worded these different than you would have, but follow my train of thought. The first thing I would say is, this is in contrast to loss of sensitivity. Be a stranger. Now, what do I mean? See, if the issue with the loss of sensitivity is that, you just have a hard heart because you just don't see what's going on around you. You've lost that sense. Practically, if you've lost it, you need to find a way to figure out what's going on around you, don't you? And one way to do that, I think, is to be a stranger. When I went to my second and third year of college, I guess, in Chicago. I remember I had a friend from Minnesota come and visit, and an ambulance went by because we were in the city. I mean, we weren't in the suburbs, and we were down the street from a hospital. Ambulance goes by. She's like, "Well, do you guys ever stop and pray for the ambulances?" Because she stopped and prayed, and we said, "That's a wonderful idea, but there's like one every hour. We don't hear them anymore. I mean, you just don't. You're insensitive to your environment because they're there so often. It wasn't a hard-heartedness. We just didn't hear it after a certain point in time." And a lot can go on around us that we may miss because it's our normal environment. We're so familiar with it that the abnormal becomes normal. There's a great quote. If you know at all my history of my education, I focused in church history for my master's degree, and I particularly studied early Christian monks who lived in caves in the desert. They're just wildly fascinating guys. I can explain it to you later if you want. One of them, they had a great influence on the church. And there's books of their sayings. I have them in my office. They're just fascinating, really enlightening. And one of them says, "A foreign monk not living in his native province will be half-hearted in nothing, and so will be at rest." You see, he can't take anything for granted. The entire world is new. He sees it all with fresh eyes. And so if for some reason you've lost sensitivity, how do you regain that? I would suggest two things. I would suggest slow down and open your eyes. Now, how do you do those things? Slowing down. When I was a hospital chaplain in the Chicago area, I remember one of the best pieces of advice I got. When you walk into a room, act like you're wading knee-deep in water because it slows you down. And as you walk into the room, the thing is, calm, if you rush in, the calmness follows you, and it'll eventually get there. But if you walk in slowly, you bring calmness with you. And that's the same way if we're trying to find sensitivity, if we're trying to open our eyes to things again, slowing down to look at the world around you will make a big difference, to begin to notice different things around you. And then I would also suggest with that, change your environment. Every 6 months, I have this burning desire to do one of two things: go on a road trip or rearrange furniture. Now, you say, why is that? Because often the road trip is not feasible every 6 months. Rearranging furniture gives me some sense of newness. We can move the couch and the chair, and that's a really cheap way to do it. I'd always rather go for the road trip, but that's not always the way it works. But that sense of newness just changes things for me, and I consider it a gift that I've been able to live over the last 15 years in a lot of different places and see a lot of different things and worship in a lot of different places. It changes your perspective. Now, I will say I don't recommend moving a lot. We've had 9 addresses in 10 years of marriage. Not a good way to do life. If you can stay in the same place, do it. I say do it. Stay where you are. But sometimes we need to get out and see the world and what's really going on. And so we have to change the way we see the world. And I have a couple you can add to these challenges, but here are just some thoughts. It's not specifically focused at any one area where we may have lost sensitivity, but drive a different way to work for a while. Even the long way. See what the world shows you and what's out there. You could, and I'm saying this from the pulpit, this targets different areas, that you may have lost sensitivity. Visit a different church some Sunday and bring back what you learn. See what the world is like when you're a stranger somewhere where nobody knows you. And bring back those feelings. Yes, I said that from the pulpit. I stand by it. I personally try to go to a coffee shop once a week. I haven't quite set up which shop that is, but I try and go to a coffee shop so I can be out of a Christian environment and with people who might not, in fact, know the story. Same place so I can connect with people. No headphones, no nothing, so I can pray and ask God. I'm still working, but I ask God for those conversations that might matter to come my way as I sit there. We need to open our eyes, slow down, change the environment sometimes to see what's around us. And it's amazing what comes your way when you do that. Ultimately, we've got to find those areas in our heart that are desensitized and ask God to change those areas. The second thing, if futile thinking or ignorance, so what that should be, futile thinking was that one, ignorance, mark your life. If our minds are filled with, I reversed those, I'm sorry. What's up there is wrong. It should be the other, reverse them. This relates to futile thinking. They could all relate to anyone. There's a crossover. But whoever did the slides, needs to have a talking to. Futile thinking actually relates to marking your life in this case, because what I was trying to relate to was the fact of idolatry and that we're filled with empty things. And you need to mark your life with the things God cares about. And so this does actually go with the previous point, even though it doesn't seem like it because I seem confused all of a sudden. But mark your life with the things God cares about. Look for specific people or areas to focus your prayer life, if you don't already do that. And more importantly, I would suggest this. Always check your sources in life. I remember reading these, I guess back in 2005, when George Barna came out with these statistics. If you don't know Barna, his group does church statistics, and they interview all kinds of people. In 2005, he was saying 9% of all born-again believers believe this. 9%, 1 out of every 10. People who go to church, in fact, is who he was pooling. That absolute moral truth exists, only 9%. That absolute moral truth is contained in the Bible, and that moral truth creates a core of beliefs in their own life. Now, you can dispute the statistics, but even if it's 9% and you add something to that, it's not that much more encouraging, is it? Of the people interviewed, these are the things that they were asking. Is the Bible accurate? Was Jesus sinless? Surprisingly, more and more people question that issue. Is Satan real? Not imaginative. Is evangelism necessary for salvation, and is salvation only found through Jesus Christ alone? Only 9% said yes to all of those, is what he said. He said the rest of the people, near as they can tell from their statistics, base that other 91% put together their belief structure based on a mix of what friends, family, media, and popular culture say. Well, that's filling your mind with empty things, isn't it, for 91% of the people, in some way, shape, or form? We can all be guilty of that at some point, but we have to fill our minds with the things God cares about. Otherwise, we will focus and eventually worship those things that God doesn't. And so we have to fill our minds as well with the relationships that matter. Look for those specific people to pray for. Look for specific places to pray. I found this an interesting practice. I have a friend named Pat in Colorado. Highly regard him, a man of faith, very deep faith. 20-minute drive to work. He prays. He has different markers on his drive. From this building to this building, I pray for these people. From this street to this street, I pray for this every morning. And you've been challenged to pray for the mission of this church. I gave you a marker for your life. Walk in the door. Pray for this place. I still have a hard time. I don't remember it every time, but I'm working on it. But what we need to do is mark our lives with the things that matter to God regularly. If it requires a place, if it requires a people group, whatever it is, somehow we need to mark our life with the things that God cares about so that we don't become insensitive to those things. We become more sensitive to those areas. And finally, I think, if I got it right, practice empathy, which also goes next to ignorance. Man, I was really off on this. I'm sorry. Practice empathy. Ignorance really is people just going around their day-to-day lives without a concern for what it's like for anyone else, right? We just don't know. It's like insensitivity. But the Apostle Paul says this is the road that leads to insensitivity. Ignorance is. So you get to loss of sensitivity, but ignorance is the road that gets us there. The other steps of tenderheartedness certainly can help with any one of these. There's great crossover, which, of course, in my genius is why I mixed up all the points. But what is empathy? Empathy, I think, is a very important part of this. I define empathy as I have a circle around me, and you have a circle around you, fake person standing here. I empathize by stepping into your circle. I'm in my circle, I'm in your circle. I haven't left my circle. We're going to have problems if I do that. But I can come and stand alongside you, and I can put some commitment to that standing alongside of you and say, I care by this. Again, I'll give you a story. When I was a hospital chaplain, I remember being dropped into one of these situations where you walk into the emergency room. A man, I didn't know it was coming, but a man comes in and he's just lost his wife. As it turns out, her name was Stephanie, my wife's name too. So that's one of those occasions where it hits you pretty hard, right, personally. She just found out in my presence that his wife had passed away. She's in the other room. Bad responses in that case are, well, that stinks, doesn't it? Right? That's an unempathetic response. Or, I'll see if I can find somebody who can stay here with you. I'm sorry, I've got other things to do. Or, yeah, I've got to go. I'm sorry for your loss. Those are unempathetic things. We can figure that out. The empathetic thing is to stand with him. He didn't need words. He needed a person who could be there. And so we walked in. We saw his wife together. And I was just with him. There are words that can be said. There are memories that can be brought up, but those come at a later time. Whatever you say or do, in reality, he just needed me to be there and stand with him and put myself somewhat in his world. How does empathy help? I think it does a number of things that works with all of this. It adds to our sources of information about the world around us, certainly. If you're empathetic, you have to understand the person you are empathizing with. But I think it brings in a very Christ-like element to all we've been talking about this morning. Because I know personally, I'm an observer. I could stand back and watch the world turn and I'd be pretty happy, right? But that's not the call we've been given. Jesus Christ didn't call us to observe the world around us, did he? Empathy doesn't let us do that. Jesus Christ called us to do in his name, not to watch in his name. That's where empathy takes us. It says, I'm going to stand and get messy with you in life and figure this out together with you and have compassion on you and with you because I care. And that's what we're called to do. That's what empathy does. It's the most powerful of the things we're talking about. Paul is calling us to a total wardrobe change. That's what we've talked about in this whole sermon series. And I think it's interesting, when you do that, when you exercise compassion, when you move to that level of empathy, there's something that we can add to that. And that is, we didn't read this morning, but it's worth bringing up. From Ephesians 5, 1 and 2, a lot of outlines put that with this section we read. It says, follow God's example, therefore. Love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. I think compassion does something. We're asked to put on that fragrance, aren't we? To be a fragrant offering like that, put on the fragrance of Christ. Smell like Jesus. You can laugh, but that's the way it is. With a total wardrobe change that Paul calls us to, he says you'd better smell right as well. And if you're putting on compassion, you will. Jesus offered himself as this fragrant offering. We're called to act accordingly. Compassion requires sacrifice on our part. And when you walk out the door each morning, as you clothe yourselves with compassion, you're supposed to be fragrant like Christ. If you practice compassion, that tender-hearted life, you're going to provide a fragrance that's pleasing to those around you. Smell is a strong thing, isn't it? We don't have to go far for me to argue that point. I think you'd all agree with me. People will ask me, do I smell, right? You get that from your family members before they walk out. Well, good or bad? That usually people are assuming bad is the answer. Smell is a strong thing. We need to smell pleasing to those around us, and that comes from that compassionate, that tender-hearted attitude that we put on because we were called to put that on. So be kind and tender-hearted. That's the call to those in church, to those at work, to those at school, to those around you, to anybody who needs it. Be kind and tender-hearted. Let's pray. God, we thank you that you called us to do in your name, not to watch in your name. And we ask for the strength to do in your name, to be sacrificial in how we empathize with others and how we step into the worlds of others who need you so desperately in some cases, who find themselves lost on the path of ignorance, on the path of futile thinking, and don't even know they're lost, Father. Help us be a compassionate, tender-hearted people with eyes to see the needs around us. We ask this all in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.